Right, well, thank you very much for inviting me to join tonight. My name's Jane and I'm an archaeologist. It's a failing, but one that I will put up with for the rest of my life. I've been lucky enough to work in London all my professional life, and a certain amount of it has been in and around this area, but particularly on the Thames. So what I want to do tonight is talk a little bit about riverine deposition. So I won't be fixating solely on the Westminster area. I'm going to go upstream a bit and downstream a little bit. What I would note now, and I'll give additional warning when we get there, I will be showing some photos of skeletons. As a group interested in history and archaeology, hopefully that will be okay. But if there is anyone that's not comfortable seeing pictures of skeletons, particularly some of whom were done to death, there'll be a moment when I say, here come the skeletons. So if anybody wants to step out for a breath of fresh air at that point, that is absolutely fine. But due warning does need to be given about these things. Right, why am I here? This is me. This is my favourite sort of place, down a hole, rummaging around, looking for new information. I started as a child wanting to learn more about the past and wanting to learn more about stories. I bunked off school to go and look at the Guildhall Yard excavations when the Roman amphitheatre was turning up, and was astounded and delighted to be working on the site 5 years later after I'd finished my degree and my master's degree at UCL, and I got a job with the Museum of London. And some of the work that I'll talk about today is work that we did at the Museum of London for the Jubilee Line extension, and some of the work I've done since on my own research into the Thames and the mysteries that it continues to throw at us. People in the 1970s did a project called The Future of London's Past, where they concluded that there would be nothing left of London's archaeology very soon. I think that was 1972, published by Professor Martin Biddle, and we continue to find new things all the time. So we are by no means exhausted, and we have by no means answered all the questions there are. I fully determined to be dead, buried, rotted, probably being dug up by the time we get anywhere near anyone thinking there's nothing left to learn about London. So we're going to talk about the Thames tonight. The river is why we are here. Thorney Island is why you are here. Thorney Island is only a small part of what the Thames does. The Thames brought people to what we know as the London area roughly 440,000 years ago, when it burst south from the Vale of St Albans following the expansion of the Ipswichian ice sheet. We've had people in this area ever since, apart from the period when there were no people at all in the Ipswichian for roughly 60,000 years. And I love bandying these times around because I think, oh, the Elizabethan, a long time ago, really, it just wasn't. So the Thames has created our valley. It's created a source of water, which creates a source of food. It creates a source for navigation, and it gives us interesting and weird places for deposition. And that's what I want to look at tonight. And I want to look particularly at the Neolithic and the Bronze Age, a little about the Iron Age and the Roman, and then pick up on a few subsequent periods of deposition. But the Neolithic is a particular period. It goes wrong in the Bronze Age. Frankly, capitalism gets invented then. And I won't say it was all lovely and wonderful in the Neolithic. It was a very, very difficult time. People changed a way of life that had worked in the UK for roughly 880,000 years. And they changed not quite overnight. So it saw a very, very seismic shift. And the Bronze Age is a continuity of that. And then things go very strange in the Roman period. Right, the Neolithic. This is a completely ridiculous picture of the Neolithic. People did not go around wearing tiger skins and having bad mullets and strange beards. But the Neolithic is a fascinating period for us and for you, because Thorney Island was still forming in the Neolithic. At the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 years ago, we saw quite a significant shift in sea level change. So prior to that, because all the water was locked up in the ice, relative sea level was relatively low compared to where it is now. Following the retreat of the ice sheets and then actually the rebound of land, the river levels in the Thames started to rise quite considerably as the tidal head moved upstream. But then in the Neolithic, roughly here, we get a decrease in the rate of sea level rise. So this area was then still a freshwater river. It was a braided river. And Thorney Island, because again of the confluence with the Tyburn, Thorney Island is still forming in the Neolithic. So you get this substantial sand island still forming. So it's not going to have been in particularly active use by people, particularly in terms of settlement, because it's still forming. At the end of the Neolithic, as we go through into the Bronze Age, roughly about 2000 to 1500 years BC, we then see an uptick in the speed of sea level rise, and that's when we get Thorney Island beginning to shrink. This is an image that makes sense to archaeologists and possibly not to everyone else, but you will know roughly where you are. So the Abbey is about there. This is roughly the shape we think Thorney Island was in the Neolithic, based on borehole evidence and where we've put archaeological trenches. So relatively large and still forming. By the time we get into the Iron Age, the river levels are much higher, both the Thames coming upstream because the tidal head we think migrates through roughly 1500 BC. And as we get into the Iron Age, which is beyond 700 BC, the Tyburn is coming up as well. So Thorney Island shrinks to this kind of core of how it was. And then as we pass beyond the Roman period, we start to see erosion of the island again. And I've put this in because we extrapolate a lot from the remains that we find. And one of the areas that I spent a lot of time doing was looking at unicellular algae. And this really isn't something that you want to talk about parties. When people ask you what you do, you really don't want to say that you spend your days looking at, but they're so lovely. They're absolutely lovely. This is one of my favorites. This is Parrelia sulcata, which is a planktonic species and really helpful for tracking where the tidal head goes. And it was looking at things like this and looking at the radiocarbon dates and looking at the sedimentology that allowed us to suggest that the tidal head came through this area in the Bronze Age. And the Bronze Age is when a lot of things happen. And I've given other talks when I've looked at timing and phasing. And some of you will be familiar with the work 1066 and all that. So it had two important dates. 1066. Is the other one AD 43? Was it the Roman invasion? Anyway, 1500 BC is the third really important date because things change then. All sorts of things change then. Patterns of life change then. And society gets quite strange. And I find that society gets a bit sad there. It's when people start doing a lot with swords, and you don't see that beforehand. Right. So you'll have seen this before, but this is our idea of plonking modern Westminster on top of Iron Age Thorney Island to give you an idea of where the island was, where the Thames was, and where the Tyburn came round both sides of it. So this is the area we're looking at, and this is the context I want you to think about. I want you to think about Thorney Island as it is still forming in the Neolithic, as it solidifies in the Bronze Age, and then as it begins to shrink into the Iron Age. And I want to talk now about what people are doing with the river, how they are using the river in the Neolithic and then through beyond the Iron Age and Roman period. And I should say that the work and the information and the finds are the result of lots and lots of people doing work. This is the Greenwich Foreshore Recording and Observation Group. I'm afraid Gustav Milne, who has done a lot of work on the river, has a terrible weakness for acronyms. So this, of course, is the frog group, and we have tadpole groups and all sorts. But there are lots of people that work on the foreshore that have permits to search and report their information very well and very diligently. There are sadly others who don't report as well as diligently, but we have a lot of information from the work of a lot of people. Some of you will have been aware of the project, the Thames Discovery Programme, who won a project for the great deal of community work that they did. And that work has given us huge amounts of new information. But also we go back a long way in terms of people that have recovered material from the Thames. So this is G.F. Lawrence, one of the great early antiquarians, who was quite rigorous in what he collected, but looking for the provenance. We have a lot of stuff out of the Thames that is marked with things like near Mortlake or by the bridge. And these are really not very helpful. And we think some of them are indeed forgeries and spurious, because if someone is willing to pay money for something that's been found, say, at Battersea, then the chances are someone is going to sell them something saying, I found this at Battersea. And that may not always have been the case. A lot of material was found when the Thames was dredged by hand, and John Cotton has done a lot of work on this as well. There's a lot of information that came from the ballast heavers, but unfortunately it means that the record is biased, because if the ballast heavers were founding very small bits of bone, they might not have known what they are. But when they dig out a human skull, they're fairly clear what that is. But it has meant that we have a surprisingly large collection of human skulls from the Thames, some of which have good provenance and some of which say things like Mortlake. So what I want to think about is what is going into the river. We find things coming out of the river, we find things on the foreshore. The question is, how did they get in there? Were they deliberately deposited? Have they been lost? Or have they eroded from the banks of the river and from buried deposits on the foreshore? And all of those can come into play. The job for us as archaeologists is to try and understand which of those routes made things get into the river, and what does that then mean? Archaeologists are regularly reported in the media as being baffled and talking about ritual and talking about votive. And it's true, we are often baffled, although we don't like to admit it. And we talk about ritual, and that's not just when we don't know what's happening. Sometimes it's actually true. And watery places are well known archaeologically around the world to be associated with watery places. Watery places, we think, are considered to be liminal zones between this world and another world, a way of conveying materials, ideas, beliefs from the solid world to a more opaque world. And so, whilst we don't know the exact reasons, the exact motivation, in places particularly associated with rivers and particularly associated with things like delta or islands in river, you do find objects that are away from the mundane. We could get into a very technical discussion on when is something functional. If it's performing a spiritual role, does that mean it's not functional? And this is something where the theoreticians will debate how many votive offerings can dance on the head of a Bronze Age pig. And we're not going to do that there. I'm just going to leave these ideas to ruminate in your brains. What is the purpose of these? And how are they getting into the river? Now, these are actually Mesolithic, so these predate the Neolithic, and this is when the sea levels are rising. These are very odd items. These are known as Thames picks, and very badly, there's no scale on these. They can be about 30 centimetres long. They're basically batons. Now, we deal with a lot of flints. We know there's a number of tools. We know that they're very well used. These are basically sticks made out of flint. So we think that they don't have a use, obviously, as a tool for performing a function such as cutting up some meat. So we are a bit perplexed about these. And so we wonder if these are some sort of item that conveys distinction on the user. And we get these, the same sort of thing in the Neolithic. Now, these earlier societies, the Mesolithic, which starts roughly 10,000 years ago to about 6,000 years ago. This is a period of transition. People are basically nomadic, but they will have fixed camps for a particular period of the year when they're following herds of animals, and sometimes there'll be seasonal times when they are settled for a bit. But these do seem to be totemistic items. These are drawings of antlers and bones, which also have been radiocarbon dated to the Mesolithic from the river. They're pierced, so we imagine that there's been something through them that we no longer have. And again, these are uncertain as to whether these are functional tools or whether they perform a more ritualistic element. When we get to the Neolithic, though, things become a bit clearer. These are two axes and mace heads that have come out of the river. They're dated stylistically to the Neolithic period. They're absolutely beautiful. They're highly polished, highly decorative, and the stone generally has come from a long way away. So we find stone in the Neolithic used in these items that comes from places like Langdales. Some of you will know that Great Langdale and Langdale Pike is a really important axe factory in the Neolithic. Some come from Cornwall, some come from Yorkshire, and bear in mind that people walk or go in boats. It's a long way. I mean, we know they move stones at Stonehenge a very long way, and this tells us a bit about society, but some of these are very, very beautiful. They have not been used. There's no scratches on them, there's no wear, so they've not been used for mundane tasks. So are they again associated with individuals? This is a period, the Neolithic, where we don't have evidence for an institutionalized hierarchy. We don't think there is evidence that people are particularly fussed about individual ornamentation, but we do think that there are items that confer a degree of status on the individuals that hold them. And it may be that these are passed around a group on a daily basis. It may not be that we have one elder, one leader, one shaman in a group, but these we think are used to convey status. This is my absolute favourite. I am indulging myself a bit tonight. So this is a jadeite polished axe. This was found in the Thames. There are a number of them from around the country, but they're astonishing objects. Firstly, absolutely beautiful, polished to the nth degree, not a scratch on it from, again, a functional or a mundane use. And this has come from the Alps. So jadeite comes from the Alps. It has found its way into the Thames from the Alps. So again, this is why we scratch our heads to think, what is the meaning of these? And what does that distance tell us about how these things move and how it has ended up in the Thames? And so this comes back to, is there a deliberate deposition of an object of high value that ends up in the Thames? Is it being taken out of use? Is it restricting accessibility to objects of this power, for want of a better word? Is it an offering into the river for a purpose? Is it seeking better times? Is it in response to a promise made? And so these are the things that we're thinking are going on at this time in the Neolithic, in the area around Westminster. We have other items. This one is from Chelsea. This is known as the Chelsea beater. It's about the size of a biggish rounder's bat. And again, we're uncertain again whether this is a functional item. Because it's wood, it doesn't survive as well as the stone. So is this functional, or is it again a sort of badge of status? We're uncertain. And then this one. This one gets at the back. It may not be as clear, and I'm going to assume that we're all mature-ish adults in here, but there's a little hole. So we're a little uncertain as to the purpose. This is known as the Dagenham idol, and it was found in the peat on the riverside in Dagenham and dates to about 2100 BC. There are a number, not many, there are a number of idols around the British Isles. They're mainly found in places like Scotland and Ireland. And this is one from the Thames. And again, what is this doing? It's in a peat deposit. It may well have been an offering. Is it a votive or is it something else? There are a number of these in Northern Europe, and some of them seem to be marking territory. So it's possible that R1 is actually marking territory in the peatlands, because the peatlands in the later Neolithic will have been used for grape. So sometimes we think these are all ritual deposits, but sometimes the evidence suggests that actually these are areas that people are settling. So remember that in the Neolithic, people are moving from a hunter-gatherer existence to a sedentary existence. And to be perfectly honest, the uptake of farming didn't seem to have been tremendously popular. It's remarkably hard work. Has anyone got an allotment? Hard work, isn't it? Imagine trying to feed an entire group of people when you've never done this before. And also bear in mind that wheat and barley were a novel European crop. They all came over from the continent. We had oats and we had rye, but they don't feed you or make beer. I don't think you can make beer with rye. So this is all very, very new, and it didn't always work, and the climate's not always brilliant. So the uptake took some time, but we have a series of sites in the peatlands on the edge of the Thames, mainly actually in East London, but not exclusively, where we have a series of trackways, we have a series of platforms, and land in the marshes is clearly being used seasonally and divided up. So things like that idol may actually be simply a marker of land, of where the fields are, where it's safe to go. Because anyone of you that's been on the foreshore and hasn't checked it out beforehand and has sunk up to their knees in mud can know that it can be treacherous. And so it may be that land is identified as safe to use and not safe to use. We've even got the plough. This was the tip of an ard, a very primitive plough that was found at an archaeological site just down by London Bridge Station. So we begin to see these areas being cultivated. And this is from cutting fields in the sand islands down by London Bridge. We've not yet found any plough marks, I think, on Thorney Island in the prehistoric period. We found them behind Tate Modern, we found them around London Bridge Station, but I don't think we've found them here yet, but give us time. And so the Neolithic, we have lovely items in the river, items that we do think are more offerings. And then when we get into the Bronze Age, so from 2000 BC onwards, this is when we start to see weaponry. And this is when I get depressed about society, because we think we transition from a society that doesn't have an ordered hierarchy to one that very much does, that very much seems to have a them and us, which very much seems to have a focus on personal ornamentation and display. And a society that has an awful lot of swords is probably indulging in a certain amount of aggression, warfare, intimidation, and the beginnings of ownership of people rather than the much flatter society we see in the Neolithic. But for us in the Thames, we have one of the finest collections of metalwork anywhere in Europe. It's astonishing. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Bronze Age swords which have been found and recovered from the Thames. And they're still turning up. We're still finding short swords periodically. I think not one a year, but one every couple of years is turning up and being reported to the Portable Antiquities scheme. There's loads of them. If the London Museum opens soon, you'll see hopefully some in there, or the prehistoric gallery is going to be reduced. There are loads in the British Museum. And if the British Museum stores ever do behind the scenes tours, they have racks and racks and racks of them. And they're really interesting because some of them seem to be pristine. Some of them have notches and big signs of wear. And some of them have been what we call deliberately slighted. So some have been bent right back on themselves, and some have been cut into pieces. You obviously have to heat a sword to slice it like that. So quite a lot of effort has gone into it. And it's why we think that some of this, again, is very deliberate deposition into the river. Some of it is how can I phrase this? Possibly individuals being a little bit full of themselves, because they're doing the, I'm so rich, I can throw a sword away. And remember that swords like this, the effort to work the bronze and to create the mold and to melt the bronze, cast it, and then finish it, that is a real prestige item. This is like us owning a Porsche or something. So there's a lot going on in how hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these have entered the river. So there have been suggestions that they've been lost, shields as well, in the river. Now, if I had lost something that valuable into the river, I would dive for it. I would really, really try and find it. And for hundreds and hundreds, they can't just have been lost. You might get a boat going down, but the River Thames isn't that deep in any of the areas that we're talking about, which is largely Mortlake up to about here. So I don't believe in that one. I do believe that some of this is deliberate. This is a site that some of you will know. So this is over the river at Vauxhall at the Albert Embankment. This is the famous Time Team site. I radiocarbon dated, well, I took the samples and submitted them for radiocarbon dating. This is a structure that was identified as a bridge, but we don't think it is. And this dates to about 1500 BC. And it had two side loop spearheads tied together or rammed into the ground beside it. And again, that's a very deliberate act. These are valuable items. You don't lose these unless you're doing it deliberately. So we have the suggestions that they might have been lost, they might have been lost in battle, and that we have the whole mythology that has come down to us ever since of the throwing the sword into water, the taking it out, the continuing the memory of the hero. That yes, we may lose the hero, yes, we may lose the sword, but they will come back in times of need. So a mythology gets created around this. And so over the centuries that these swords were being deposited, the chances are that there is a very elaborate mythology that is developing around this process. This is a reconstruction of the structure at Vauxhall. We don't have the deck, we have the uprights. They're paired, they're very substantial. And I made a suggestion on the basis of an auger survey that we'd done and our understanding of what the tidal head was doing, and the fact that we have two little branches of the Ephra coming out at that point, and probably the two southern branches of the Tyburn in this area. So all of that, with the tidal head of the Thames coming through, would create quite a confluence. And I suspect it would have created a sandbar in this location. So because of the churning of all the waters, we might get an area where you would get a deposition. So I've wondered whether the structure that was clearly built at this point of Vauxhall is going out to a small sand island. I'm not terribly convinced about the sheep or the goats. It would be a very small island. And I wondered, because of what I'm going to come on to next, whether actually the island was being used for the deposition of burials. Now, in the Bronze Age, we have relatively few cemeteries, but we have quite a lot of people. We know this. So I wonder whether the river is being used to take burials away, whether you deposit them and they're taken off as the tide rises and flows out. So no evidence whatsoever for that, but I do wonder about it because of the large number of skulls that we find. Battles has been suggested, and Professor Richard Bradley did quite a seminal article, not just on the metalwork, but all the human remains from the Thames. And he published this in the 1980s, suggesting that of the skulls that he'd looked at, a lot were young men from the Bronze Age, and he wondered whether many of them had died in periods of conflict. Naturally, as a woman that gets a bit bored on the subject of swords and battles, I thought, this can't be true. And we'll come back to that. Hubris is a wonderful thing. Battles. Trade. Trade is something a bit dull, but one of the reasons that, and I'm probably going to offend any Brexiteers, I don't care. One of the reasons that Britain was something in prehistory is we've got tin, which you must have for bronze, and we're on the sea routes between Scandinavia, who were the big players in the Mesolithic and the Neolithic and the Bronze Age, and Portugal. The Isle of Thanet, I mean, it is hilarious. The Isle of Thanet is not the most exciting place in Britain, but the Isle of Thanet in the Bronze Age was top spot because it's where the trade route was. So people would stop here and trade, and they needed tin. They had to have tin. And so it's quite possible that the Thames is part of that network, and we are important in the Bronze Age because of tin and the trade routes. So it may be that some of these materials are derived from that network across Europe of trade routes, of maritime trade routes. And so it may be that things like this founder's hoard from Havering is associated with that, because scrap metal would be reused and repurposed and could be sold on. And so some of these hoards, again, may be part of that transnational trade across Europe. Okay. Anyone not comfortable with lots of pictures of dead bodies, feel free to walk out, and feel free to walk out at any time. But as well as the Thames having the most amazing collection of metalwork, it has an astonishing collection of human remains. Now, I knew a lot about this, and then about 5 years ago, no, slightly more, just before COVID, I was approached to help supervise a PhD student who was looking at 200 skulls that the Natural History Museum had. And who knew? Who knew they had 200 skulls that we didn't know about in their collections? Skulls. So I want to take you through a number of the human remains either buried at the very edge of the Thames on the foreshore or, frankly, from within the river. This is our earliest proper burial. This is from Blackwall. This is known as the Yapsley Street burial, and she dates to the plank that lines the cut in which she is buried dates to almost exactly 4000 BC, so the very beginning of the Neolithic. She was wearing a pot on her head of Grimston Lisle hillware, which is the earliest Neolithic pottery, and she had a series of flints in the grave. She's just above the river, so she's our earliest buried Londoner. Putney. I will return to Putney many, many times. Has anyone been to the Putney foreshore? It's amazing. It's a very shallow, large foreshore, and this is by the bridge. And it has astonishing amounts of remains. It's been very well studied by the Wandsworth Historical Society, and Pamela Greenwood will be publishing that in the next few years, I hope. But many of the remains that we find are bits of skull, and these turn up regularly. Thames permit holders, mudlarkers, find them and report them to the police. And occasionally we hear about this. So there's just been another 2 from Putney that I heard about in the last few weeks that date to the Roman and the Iron Age. But we have Neolithic, we have Bronze Age, we have Iron Age, we have Iron Age, we have Roman, and I think a bit later from Putney. So there's clearly a nexus there. Yes, very much Piccadilly Circus in the prehistoric period. Fennings Wharf is another very interesting site. Fennings Wharf is at London Bridge, and this has clearly been a crossing point of the Thames. It's quite narrow there, it's quite shallow there. It's where the Romans built London Bridge, where they built the next London Bridge, and where London Bridge continues to be built. It's a very strategic position. And in prehistory, we find that strategic river positions, where there are crossings, are often marked in several ways, and often you'll find prehistoric barrows there. We didn't have the trace of the barrow from Fennings Wharf. That had been removed. It's right at the southern bridgehead. It's just above the foreshore. And in the remains of the barrow, there was a primary burial And then there were 7 cremations in the ditch of the burial mound. And these are early to mid Bronze Age. So we know that location, almost guarding the access across the river, has been significant for nearly 4,000 years. I can't resist this. Made in Chelsea, there's a lot going on the Chelsea foreshore as well. This was found a very long time ago, and I'm sure some of you will be familiar with it. This is the Chelsea skull. Dates to about 1500 BC. So again, that date is a trigger for something going on in London. Big hole here. This is where this person had an operation. So this is known as trephination, where basically you get a hole cut in your head. It was done either with a metal blade or sometimes with a shell, and it's thought to relieve pressure on the brain. And we know this person survived because the bone regrew slightly, so we know they lived for some months afterwards. So it's fascinating anyway, but it's eroding out of the foreshore at Little Cheney Walk, Chelsea. After that one was found, then someone's left leg turned up, dating to the Neolithic, so the Middle Neolithic, and then someone else's left leg turned up, dating to the Bronze Age period. So we have a series of people buried in the foreshore here, in the Neolithic and in the Bronze Age, and the Chelsea Rounders Club comes from exactly this site as well. So the site's in use for some time, potentially for burial again, giving things to the river. Another one from Putney, Iron Age this time. And again, these are eroding out of the foreshore. There's a lot of issues about, are things just bobbing along in the river? I'm afraid when bodies go into the river, they separate and they move in different manners, and the skulls move in a different manner. But a lot of these are eroding out of good archaeological deposits, so they were buried there deliberately. Now, as we move into the Iron Age, things change again. So we had all the weaponry associated with the Bronze Age. In the Iron Age, we get more ceremonial goods and potentially more personal goods. This is the Battersea tankard, which I think holds 8 pints of beer. Well, it holds 8 pints. Doesn't necessarily have to be beer. And so you get items like this. The Waterloo helmet, Iron Age again, not Viking, it's the Iron Age that had horn helmet. Absolutely beautiful, but a very personal item. And then the finest of them all, the Battersea shield. So again, late Iron Age, and unbelievably striking, unbelievably ornate, absolutely beautiful. You can see it in the British Museum. If you haven't, then go and see it. It's fab. These sorts of items are more personal. And I think, again, this is evidence that potentially people are being buried in the river. They're being put into the river with these very high prestige goods, and they're taken away on the river to wherever it is they go next. Again, the suggestion has been that in the Roman period, what we're seeing is deriving from battles. And of course, we have accounts of battles, we have accounts of fording the river, but how true any of these are is a moot point. We see relatively few Roman remains in the river. These are from the Walbrook, and there was a suggestion for a long time that the Walbrook skulls were from battles or from sacrifice or slaves. And what we now know is that the Roman cemetery a little bit further up the Walbrook was not located very happily because the river eroded the cemetery. And so that's what's happening with the Walbrook skulls. Another one from Putney. We have a few Saxons who are buried on the foreshore, and these are quite unusual. The Saxon occupation is not a period of rape and pillage. It's a period of not being urban dwellers and forming settlements on the southern outskirts of London. So Ham and Ton are very much Saxon place names. So Hammersmith, Croydon, Mitcham, Fulham, these are all areas of Saxon occupation. This is actually from the foreshore at Corney Reach at Chiswick, and it's a very large Saxon person, about 6'2" or so, and seems to have been staked down. Saxon burial is normally quite regulated, but you get what are known as deviant burials, and this would seem to be a deviant burial. Why pegged on the foreshore, hopefully dead at the time, is uncertain, but it's something that triggers thoughts in how is the river being used to commit the person to where they're going next. And that is very obvious from this site at Vintry at Bull Wharf in the city. This is a Saxon burial from this period, fairly obvious how the person died. She was also pegged on the foreshore. She was wrapped in birch, and we think a marker was raised over her, but pegged down. And this is a sure sign of deviancy. If you need to make sure that the dead person isn't going to get up, then there's something quite strange and ritualistic going on. And again, the river is being used as a medium for disposing of either the dead or the spirit of the dead in these cases. The date is very interesting. The chances are that this person was buried well before King Alfred brought Saxon London from Covent Garden into the city of London, which I think was 882 or 888. So the chances are she was buried there, isolated from the Saxon settlement and pegged down. And then we have some later burials. This was a burial that we excavated relatively close to Tower Bridge. We'd had a report from a mudlarker. They'd found Neolithic pottery, Neolithic flints, and a body. So we got very excited, thinking we had a Neolithic body, and the foreshore plays tricks on you. When we radiocarbon dated her, she turned out to be really quite modern indeed, and she had sunk through the deposit, biffed on the head and relatively late. And what we see is downstream of Tower Bridge, we tend to get the later burials. And there are a number of which I thought I'd mention this one because hubris. And then this one because it's amazing. This is part of the Thames Tideway Tunnel at Chambers Wharf. This is a person upside down, sunk through the mud on the foreshore. And the very exciting thing with this is clearly a pirate because wearing leather boots, which survived, Spanish or Morocco leather. And so we have a skeleton still in its leather boots, not yet completely dated, but from this later post-medieval period. So a really, really lovely find. But again, we're looking at people that have probably lived and died by violence on the river and have been consumed by the river, slung in to dispose of the bodies. I mentioned a PhD earlier. This is Nicola who did the work, and she looked at 200 of the skulls. She did detailed scientific work on a number of them. We radiocarbon dated 38 of them, and we were looking to test Richard Bradley's hypothesis that lots of the skulls were young men from the Bronze Age who had died of violence. What we found was lots of the skulls were young men from the Bronze Age who had died by violence, which was absolutely fascinating. Certainly not all of them, but a large proportion date from that period. And it's a period where we go from the Neolithic, which is a more ordered and flat society, making this transition as we evolve in society to a society that is more aggressive, that is more violent, that is more interested in hierarchy and more interested in particular status. And we see that through the weaponry, we see that through the objects, and unfortunately we see it through the trauma on the bones of the bodies that we have found from the river. So this is the article that Nicola published earlier this year. And so we're back to this. We're back to how do these items get into the river? We don't know for all of them. We know that a number are eroding out of deliberately buried deposits. We know that a number have been put into the river. We don't know where. We know where they ended up in many cases. We still have a lot to learn. Whole taking swords out of circulation, creating a myth, creating origin myths, but creating legends that people will come back, that they are associated forever with the Thames, is something that will continue to endure. And I hope that has been of interest. I hope that as you're walking along the river, you'll start thinking about what is still there to be found. Because believe me, they were very wrong in 1972 when they thought we'd found everything. Things are still turning up year on year. We will still learn more about it. We're never going to have all the answers, but I hope that sparked some curiosity and some thoughts in you. So thank you very much for listening.